The morning was calm when an elderly woman named Grace Davis walked slowly into the busy airport terminal. She wore a soft beige sweater, a long skirt, and carried a small black handbag. Her steps were steady, but her face showed the quiet tiredness of someone who had lived many years and carried many experiences. People around her rushed in different directions, some dragging big suitcases, others glued to their phones. Grace moved differently, calm, graceful, and without hurry. She wasn't a famous person, and no one at the airport knew that she was the mother of Marcus Davis, one of the most powerful black CEOs in the country. To her, she was just a mother traveling to visit her son and spend some days together after his busy schedule finally gave him time. Grace held a first-class boarding pass in her hand. Marcus had bought it for her because he wanted her to travel in comfort. He always said his mother deserved the best after everything she had done for him when he was young. She had raised him alone, working multiple jobs, and now that he was successful, he made sure she lived a life of ease. For Grace, it wasn't about luxury. She didn't care about fancy hotels or expensive cars. What mattered to her was being close to her son, seeing him happy, and knowing she had raised him to be a good man. But still, she accepted his gifts because she knew it was his way of saying thank you. At the check-in counter, Grace handed her boarding pass to the airline staff. The young woman scanned it, smiled politely, and directed her to the first-class lounge. Grace gave a small nod, adjusted her handbag strap, and walked on. Everything seemed fine so far. She wasn't used to first class, but she thought of it as just another seat, one that would let her rest more comfortably during the long flight. As she entered the waiting area, she noticed the difference. Plush seats, complimentary snacks, and a quieter atmosphere than the crowded gate area outside. She sat down quietly, not touching the snacks, simply folding her hands in her lap. Other travelers sat nearby, some in suits, others wearing designer clothes. Grace, in her simple outfit, looked different, but she didn't feel uncomfortable. She had learned long ago that dignity came from inside, not from clothes or status. After some time, boarding was announced. Grace stood up, straightened her skirt, and walked toward the gate with her boarding pass ready. The attendant smiled briefly and scanned her ticket. Everything was fine, and she was directed to board first with the other first-class passengers. She walked down the jet bridge slowly, holding the railing, until she reached the aircraft door. The smell of fresh coffee and new carpet filled the air as she stepped into the plane. The cabin crew greeted her with routine smiles, but one attendant's expression shifted when he saw her. Perhaps he noticed her simple clothing, or perhaps he made assumptions without knowing the truth. Grace didn't notice, she only smiled back kindly and made her way to her assigned seat in first class. The seat was spacious, larger than she expected. She carefully placed her handbag in the overhead bin, sat down, and looked around curiously. It was her first time in such a cabin, and she observed the details: the wide leather seats, the small reading lamps, the folded blankets resting neatly on the armrests. She thought of how her son must have flown like this many times for his work. She felt a little closer to his world now. With a small sigh, she leaned back and folded her hands, waiting for takeoff. As more passengers entered the cabin, the atmosphere began to shift. Some greeted each other with familiarity, others ordered drinks before the plane had even left the ground. A few glanced at Grace, then looked away quickly. She noticed their curious stares but didn't mind. She had lived too many years to worry about what strangers thought. She simply wanted a peaceful journey. One of the flight attendants walked down the aisle checking tickets. When she reached Grace, she gave her a long look before asking, "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again?" Grace smiled politely and handed it over without question. The attendant scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing slightly. After a short pause, she handed it back with a forced smile, saying only, "Thank you." Grace took it back and nodded, not realizing that the attendant had doubted whether she truly belonged in first class. The boarding continued. A businessman in a sharp navy suit settled into the seat across from her. He glanced at Grace, then looked away with a small shake of his head. A young couple whispered to each other a few rows down. Grace sat calmly, her face serene, unaware of the unspoken judgments around her. For her, this was just a trip to see her son, nothing more. A few minutes later, another attendant approached, carrying a tray of drinks. She served champagne and orange juice to the passengers, but when she reached Grace, she hesitated for a moment before offering her a glass of water. Grace accepted it with a smile, not bothered by the difference. She was grateful for anything and thought perhaps the attendant was just being kind. She didn't notice that the gesture came from doubt, not kindness. As the final passengers boarded, the first-class cabin grew busy with chatter. Grace sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. She thought about Marcus, imagining his smile when he would see her at the airport. She remembered the days when she used to walk him to school, holding his hand tightly because the neighborhood wasn't always safe. She thought of the nights she stayed awake sewing clothes or cleaning offices just to put food on the table. Those memories filled her heart with warmth. All those sacrifices had led to this moment, her son, successful and respected, finally giving her the comfort she had once only dreamed about. Yet, as she sat there, the subtle glances and whispers around her began to build a quiet tension. She sensed something, though she couldn't quite put it into words. It wasn't the seat or the space. It was the feeling that some people didn't think she belonged there. But Grace reminded herself of her son's words, "Mom, you deserve this. Never let anyone make you feel less." She closed her eyes for a moment, repeating those words in her heart, steadying herself for the journey ahead. The crew continued their preparations, but behind their polite smiles, a few of them exchanged doubtful looks. To them, Grace didn't look like the usual first-class passenger. She wasn't wearing expensive jewelry, she didn't carry a designer handbag, and she didn't walk with the air of someone used to luxury. To Grace, none of that mattered. She knew her worth, even if strangers did not. What she didn't know was that soon, the quiet judgments would turn into something more direct, something that would test not only her patience but her dignity. The engines outside began to hum as the plane prepared for departure. Passengers settled into their seats, fastening seat belts, adjusting pillows, and preparing for the long journey. Grace did the same, folding her hands neatly and whispering a small prayer for a safe flight. She had no idea that within the next hour, her quiet dignity would face a challenge that would shake the entire cabin. What began as a normal flight would soon turn into a story that no one on that plane would ever forget. The plane was almost ready for departure when Grace noticed the same flight attendant returning down the aisle. This time, the woman's expression was not friendly. She leaned slightly toward Grace and asked again, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Grace, surprised, gave a small smile. "Yes, dear. This is seat 2A. My son bought me the ticket." She reached into her handbag and pulled out her boarding pass. The attendant scanned it with a handheld device, then frowned as if something were wrong. Passengers nearby started glancing toward them, curious about the small scene unfolding. The businessman in the navy suit shifted in his seat, clearly listening. The attendant spoke firmly, though not loudly. "I think there's been some mistake. This seat is for a first-class passenger. You might want to check again, perhaps your seat is in economy." Grace blinked, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ticket out again. "But, it says first class here." Her voice was calm, not defensive, but with a note of confusion. She had never been challenged like this before. The attendant sighed softly, the kind of sigh that carried judgment. "Let me check with my supervisor." Without waiting for a response, she walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward slightly and muttered, "Unbelievable." He shook his head as if Grace were trying to cheat her way into luxury. The young couple whispered to each other again, their eyes darting toward Grace and then away. Grace sat frozen, unsure of what to do. She was not someone who liked confrontation. All her life, she had believed in patience, in waiting calmly until things settled. But now, in this new world of luxury cabins and expensive seats, her patience felt like weakness. She clutched the ticket in her lap and stared at the seat back in front of her, trying to hold back tears. Moments later, the supervisor, a tall man with neatly combed hair, approached. The first attendant whispered something quickly into his ear before stepping back. He then turned to Grace with a practiced smile. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again?" Grace handed it over, her hands still shaking. He looked at the ticket carefully, then at her. "This is a first-class ticket," he admitted. "But we're just trying to confirm. Sometimes these things get mixed up." Grace gave a small nod. "My son bought it for me. He wanted me to travel comfortably." Her words were soft, almost apologetic, as if she needed to explain herself for sitting where her son had placed her. The supervisor glanced once more at the ticket, then returned it. "We'll sort this out," he said quickly before walking away with the first attendant. But instead of easing, the tension grew. Another attendant passed by, looking at Grace with a puzzled expression. The businessman across the aisle muttered again, "Ridiculous." His tone was sharp enough for Grace to hear this time. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed. She thought of Marcus, of how proud he always was to buy her nice things. He always said, "Mom, you carried me when we had nothing. Let me carry you now." She had never wanted to burden him, but she had allowed him this gift. And now that gift had turned into a humiliation in front of strangers. Minutes passed. Passengers continued to board, filling the first-class cabin. Luggage rolled down the aisle, conversations buzzed, and the hum of the engines grew louder. But Grace's heart beat fast, every second heavier than the last. Then the first attendant returned, her voice firmer now. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to move to economy. There's been a mistake in the system." Gasps rose from a few nearby passengers who had been listening. Grace's eyes widened in shock. She held the ticket close to her chest. "But this is my seat. I don't understand." The attendant's tone grew sharper. "We don't want to cause a scene. Please collect your things and move." Grace looked around helplessly. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cabin on her. The businessman smirked slightly, as if satisfied. The young couple avoided her gaze but kept whispering. A woman behind her looked on with sympathy, shaking her head gently as if she disapproved of the crew's behavior. Grace swallowed hard. "This is the seat my son gave me. Please, I have the right to sit here." Her voice was steady but quiet, the quiet of someone who was hurt more than angry. The attendant crossed her arms. "Ma'am, if you don't move, you'll delay this flight." That was when Grace felt something break inside her. She had lived a long life, faced many struggles, worked harder than most, and sacrificed everything for her son. And now, with a valid ticket in her hand, she was being treated as if she didn't belong. Her eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show weakness. "I have done nothing wrong," she whispered to herself. But her whisper was drowned out by the chatter of the cabin. The supervisor returned once again, trying to soften the situation. "Ma'am, maybe it's better if you come with me and we sort this out. We don't want to make you uncomfortable." But Grace knew what he really meant. They wanted her out of the seat, out of sight, away from the world of luxury where they thought she did not belong. Slowly, she stood up, her small frame trembling. She reached for her handbag from the overhead bin. Her hands shook so badly that another passenger, the sympathetic woman behind her, offered to help. Grace managed a small, broken smile and whispered, "Thank you." The sympathetic woman frowned at the crew. "She has a first-class ticket. You can't just push her out like this." But the crew ignored her protest. The supervisor motioned politely toward the aisle, waiting for Grace to step out. The elderly woman clutched her handbag close, her dignity fighting against her humiliation. As she stepped into the aisle, the cabin fell silent. Passengers stared, some with judgment, some with pity, some with quiet outrage. Grace kept her eyes down, walking slowly, as if carrying the weight of all their stares. Her mind raced. She thought of Marcus again, of how much he loved her, of how much he wanted her to be respected. What would he say if he knew what was happening? She didn't want to trouble him, didn't want him to see her humiliated. But deep down, she knew he would not stand for this. The attendant followed close behind, her face stern. Grace's heart ached with every step. She felt out of place, unwanted, even though the truth was in her hand, the boarding pass that said she belonged right where she had been sitting. As she reached the front of the cabin, just before stepping toward the economy section, the sound of footsteps behind her stopped her in her tracks. A tall, familiar figure had just entered the plane. The air shifted instantly. The silence deepened. Every eye that had been on Grace now turned to the man walking down the aisle. Grace turned slowly, and her heart leapt. It was Marcus. Marcus Davis stepped onto the plane with his usual calm confidence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a simple but sharp navy blazer and dark trousers. His presence filled the narrow aisle as he walked forward, pulling a small carry-on behind him. Many passengers didn't recognize him at first, but a few did. A quiet murmur rippled across the first-class cabin as people whispered his name. Marcus was a well-known figure in the business world. He had built his reputation as a brilliant leader, a visionary who had transformed his company from struggling beginnings into one of the largest corporations in America. News articles often wrote about his sharp mind, his speeches about equality, and his passion for fairness in business. Some called him one of the most respected black CEOs in the nation. But today, Marcus wasn't thinking about business. He was just a son traveling with his mother, planning to enjoy some rare, quiet time together. The moment he stepped into the cabin, his eyes went straight to Grace. He saw her standing in the aisle, clutching her handbag tightly against her chest, her small frame trembling. Around her, the cabin was silent, the atmosphere heavy with discomfort. Passengers stared but said nothing. The crew stood stiffly, trying to keep control of the situation. "Mom." Marcus's voice was calm but carried an edge of concern. Grace turned toward him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Relief washed over her face when she saw him. She gave him a small smile, but her voice trembled as she said, "Marcus, they told me I didn't belong here." The entire cabin froze. Those who hadn't recognized Marcus before now leaned forward, realizing something big was happening. The businessman across the aisle, who had been smirking earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The sympathetic woman behind Grace folded her arms tightly, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Then, in a calm voice that carried power, he asked the crew, "Who told my mother she couldn't sit in her seat?" The first attendant, the one who had spoken rudely earlier, hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the supervisor, silently pleading for help. The supervisor cleared his throat and tried to keep his voice even. "Sir, there was some confusion. We were simply trying to confirm her seat." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his calm expression not changing. "Her seat is 2A. That's what the ticket says. That's where she sat. Why did she have to stand up?" The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. He tried to smile. "Sometimes passengers," Marcus cut him off, still calm, but his voice firmer now. Sometimes passengers what? Sometimes elderly women are humiliated in front of strangers because your crew decided they didn't look like they belonged. The words hung in the air like thunder. No one in the cabin moved. The businessman who had judged Grace earlier lowered his eyes. The young couple who had whispered now sat frozen, ashamed of their earlier thoughts. Grace touched her son's arm gently, trying to calm him. "Marcus, it's all right. Please don't make a scene. I'll just sit anywhere." Marcus turned to her, his voice softening. "Mom, you don't ever have to move from your rightful place. Not for anyone." Passengers around them felt the weight of his words. They weren't just about a seat on a plane. They were about dignity, respect, and the value of every person, no matter how they looked. The supervisor tried again, his voice weaker now. "Sir, we apologize if there was any misunderstanding." Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was disrespect. And I don't accept it. Not toward my mother. Not toward anyone." At that moment, a few passengers clapped softly, their applause quickly growing louder. Others nodded firmly, showing their support. The sympathetic woman behind Grace spoke up loudly. "She showed her ticket. You still tried to push her out. That wasn't a mistake. That was unfair." The cabin filled with murmurs of agreement. The businessman who had been rude earlier muttered under his breath, "I didn't realize," but his voice faded into silence. Marcus helped his mother back into her seat, carefully guiding her to sit down again in 2A. He placed her handbag gently by her side and made sure she was comfortable. Then he straightened, standing tall in the aisle, and turned his full attention back to the crew. "I am Marcus Davis," he said evenly, his deep voice carrying across the cabin. "I am the CEO of the company that owns a controlling stake in this airline. And you thought you could treat my mother like she didn't belong here." Gasps rose around the cabin. Several passengers leaned forward in shock. Now, even those who hadn't known his face understood the gravity of the situation. The crew turned pale, their eyes wide with sudden recognition. The first attendant stammered, her words tumbling over themselves. "Yes, sir, I didn't realize." Marcus stopped her with a raised hand. "You didn't need to realize who she was. You only needed to see that she had a valid ticket and treat her with respect. That is your job. And you failed." The silence in the cabin grew heavier. Every passenger was listening, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Marcus remained calm, his tone steady, but the authority in his words was undeniable. Grace sat quietly in her seat, looking at her son with both pride and concern. She never liked scenes, but she also knew Marcus was right. He wasn't just defending her, he was defending the principle that no one should ever be judged by appearance. Marcus pulled out his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness was more powerful than anger. He scrolled quickly, then pressed a number. Within seconds, he was speaking. "Yes, this is Marcus Davis. I'm on flight 726, first class cabin. My mother was just asked to leave her seat despite having a valid ticket. I want the head of operations informed immediately. This is unacceptable." The crew stood frozen, unable to respond. The supervisor swallowed hard, sweat forming at his hairline. The first attendant looked down at her shoes, her earlier confidence gone completely. Marcus ended the call and looked back at them. "You've embarrassed this airline. And more importantly, you've humiliated my mother. That will not be forgotten." A murmur of approval spread through the cabin. Some passengers clapped softly again, this time louder. The sympathetic woman gave a firm nod. Even the young couple whispered to each other, clearly regretting their earlier assumptions. Marcus sat down next to his mother finally, his strong presence like a shield around her. He took her hand gently, his expression softening once more. It's all right now, Mom. You don't have to worry anymore. Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes, her voice trembling. I didn't want to trouble you, Marcus. He smiled gently, squeezing her hand. You'll never be a trouble to me. You're the reason I'm here today. You're the reason I can sit in any seat, anywhere in the world. No one can take that dignity away from you. The cabin settled again, though the tension still hung in the air. Everyone knew this flight would not be like any other. What had begun as humiliation for one quiet elderly woman had now turned into a powerful moment of truth. Passengers glanced between Marcus and his mother, their faces a mix of admiration and guilt. The crew avoided eye contact, their earlier confidence shattered. And Grace, though still shaken, felt strength return to her heart. She wasn't alone. Her son was by her side, and the world had just witnessed his calm but powerful stand for her dignity. What no one knew was that this was only the beginning. The consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the cabin walls of that aircraft. The plane had not yet taken off, but the tension in the cabin was so heavy that every passenger felt it. After Marcus calmly but firmly defended his mother, silence had fallen like a blanket over the first-class section. The crew stood stiffly, avoiding eye contact, while Grace sat quietly in her seat, holding her son's hand. Her dignity had been bruised, but Marcus's presence was like a shield. She felt safer now, though her heart still ached from the humiliation she had just faced. Marcus leaned slightly toward her, whispering gently, "You don't need to say anything else, Mom. I'll handle it." Grace gave him a small nod, her eyes moist but steady. She had raised her son to be strong, but she was always amazed at how calmly he used that strength. He was not loud, not harsh, but every word he spoke carried weight. The supervisor, still trying to regain control, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, we truly apologize. There seems to have been confusion. We didn't mean to upset your mother." Marcus turned to face him. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, filled with quiet authority. "Confusion?" he asked softly. "Confusion is when a bag goes missing. Confusion is when a seat is double booked. This was not confusion. This was judgment." The words sank deep into the silence. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, nodding in agreement. The sympathetic woman behind Grace spoke up again, her voice stronger this time. "He's right. I saw everything. She showed her ticket. You still pushed her out." The supervisor's face turned red. He cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "We'll make it right, sir. We'll offer her an upgrade." Marcus's eyebrow arched slightly. "An upgrade? She already had the highest seat on this plane. The only thing you need to offer is respect, and it should have been given from the start." Soft applause broke out from the back of the cabin. Passengers who had been silent earlier now voiced their agreement. "He's right," one man called. Another added, "This is unacceptable." The crew looked shaken. They were not used to being challenged so openly, especially not in front of a full cabin. The first attendant, who had first questioned Grace, stood frozen, her earlier confidence completely gone. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Marcus took out his phone again. This time, he didn't speak quietly. His voice was low, steady, but loud enough for everyone in the first-class section to hear. "Yes, this is Marcus Davis. I need to speak to operations immediately. I'm on flight 726. There's been misconduct by your crew toward a first-class passenger, my mother. Replace the crew before departure." "Yes, before departure. I'll wait." Gasps echoed through the cabin. Some passengers covered their mouths in surprise. Others nodded firmly, whispering to one another about what they were witnessing. It was rare to see someone of Marcus's stature act with such precision in real time. He was not shouting, not threatening, but his calm decision carried more power than anger ever could. The supervisor swallowed hard. "Sir, please, this will cause delays." Marcus turned to him with an even gaze. "Delays are nothing compared to the cost of dignity lost. If this airline can replace a faulty engine part before takeoff, then it can replace crew members who failed at their duty. My mother will not fly under the service of people who humiliated her." The entire cabin erupted in applause this time. Passengers clapped louder, their voices rising in agreement. Even those who had stayed silent until now joined in. The businessman across the aisle, who had earlier doubted Grace, looked ashamed. He leaned forward slightly and murmured, "I'm sorry, ma'am," but his words were drowned out by the sound of passengers supporting Marcus's stand. The crew exchanged nervous glances. They knew there was no way out. A call had already been made to the highest level of airline management. Marcus Davis was not just any passenger, he was the CEO of a corporation with ownership ties to the airline itself. His words carried more weight than they could ever imagine. Within minutes, the captain himself stepped out of the cockpit. A tall man with a commanding presence, he looked around the cabin, immediately sensing the storm he had walked into. His eyes landed on Marcus, then on Grace, before turning to the crew. "What happened here?" the captain asked, his voice firm. The supervisor stammered, "There was a misunderstanding." Marcus stood slowly, towering in the aisle. "There was no misunderstanding. Your crew humiliated my mother. They demanded she leave her rightful seat because they judged her by how she looked, not by the boarding pass in her hand. That is unacceptable." The captain's face hardened. He looked directly at the crew, his jaw tightening. Then, after a long pause, he nodded once. "Very well." He turned to the supervisor and the attendants. "Step aside. You're being replaced for this flight." The crew's faces turned pale. The first attendant shook her head slightly in disbelief. "Captain, please," but the captain's voice cut through sharply. "No excuses. You failed in your duty to treat every passenger with respect. Step aside immediately." A ripple of astonishment swept through the cabin. Passengers murmured, some applauding again. Grace sat in her seat, wide-eyed, barely believing what was happening. She had never seen such a thing in her life. Replacement staff were called in quickly from the standby team at the airport. While they arrived, the dismissed crew members gathered their things, their heads lowered. They avoided Marcus's gaze, avoided the passengers' eyes, and walked quietly down the aisle. The first attendant glanced once at Grace before lowering her head and hurrying off the plane. As they left, the passengers broke into applause once more, this time louder than before. Some even stood up, clapping firmly, showing their support not only for Marcus but also for Grace. She felt her cheeks grow warm, embarrassed by the attention, but at the same time, a sense of justice washed over her. Marcus finally sat back down beside his mother. He took her hand gently and gave her a reassuring smile. "It's over now, Mom. You're safe. You'll be treated with the respect you deserve." Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes. Her voice was soft but filled with emotion. "Marcus, I don't know what to say. I never wanted you to go through all this trouble for me." Marcus shook his head gently. "It's not trouble, Mom. It's the least I can do. All my life, you fought for me. Now it's my turn to fight for you." The passengers around them heard his words, and many were touched. Some nodded, others smiled warmly at Grace, silently sending her their respect. Even those who had judged her earlier now looked ashamed of themselves. The new crew arrived quickly, greeting the passengers with polite smiles and respectful tones. They moved with efficiency, clearly aware of the weight of the situation they were stepping into. Every passenger could feel the difference instantly. The tension that had hung in the cabin slowly began to lift. The captain returned to the cockpit, and soon the announcement came over the speakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are now ready for departure." As the plane prepared to take off, Marcus leaned back in his seat, still holding his mother's hand. Grace looked out the window, her heart filled with mixed emotions: sadness for what she had endured, pride for the son she had raised, and relief that justice had been done. The engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky. Passengers settled in, but many still glanced at Grace with new eyes. No longer did they see just an elderly woman in simple clothes. They saw a mother whose dignity had been defended, a woman whose quiet strength had inspired a powerful response from her son. What had started as an ordinary flight had turned into a moment none of them would forget. And for Marcus and Grace, it was more than just a flight. It was a reminder of love, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The plane was finally in the air. The engines hummed steadily, and the world outside the windows faded into clouds. Inside the cabin, the earlier tension had begun to soften. With the new crew attending kindly to the passengers, things felt calmer, though the memory of what had happened still lingered in the air. Every person in the first-class section knew they had witnessed something unusual, something they would remember long after the flight ended. Grace sat quietly in her seat, looking out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, but her heart was still heavy. She hadn't wanted this. She had only wanted to sit in peace, to enjoy the journey, to see her son smile when they landed together. But instead, she had been made to feel small. The only comfort was knowing that Marcus had been there, strong and unshaken, standing up for her in a way she never expected. She turned to her son, who was sitting beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers. "Marcus," she said softly, "you didn't have to do all of that for me. I would have been all right." Marcus looked at her with warmth in his eyes. "Mom, no. You would not have been all right. You were humiliated in front of strangers for no reason. You had every right to that seat. You had every right to respect. I won't ever let anyone treat you like you're less." Grace's lips trembled into a small smile. "You've grown into such a strong man, Marcus. I remember when you were just a little boy, carrying a backpack bigger than your body, telling me you wanted to be a leader one day. You always had this fire in you." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That fire came from you, Mom. You carried me through the hardest times. I wouldn't be sitting here today if it weren't for you. Everything I am, every success, every step forward, it's all because of you." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting others to see. But Marcus noticed and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Don't cry, Mom. This isn't a moment of sadness. It's a reminder. A reminder that dignity must always be protected. If we don't stand for it, then we lose it." Around them, passengers who overheard grew thoughtful. Some nodded quietly, reflecting on their own lives. The sympathetic woman behind Grace leaned forward slightly and said kindly, "Your son is right, ma'am. He did the right thing. You deserve nothing less." Grace gave the woman a warm smile, touched by her words. For the first time since boarding, she felt truly seen by someone other than her son. Hours passed as the plane soared through the skies. The new crew worked with respect and care, checking on every passenger without judgment. Grace was offered tea, and Marcus ordered a meal for her, making sure she ate comfortably. Slowly, the tight knot in her chest began to ease. But outside of the cabin, news of what had happened was already spreading. Marcus's call to operations had been taken seriously. Airline executives were alerted before the plane even left the ground. Word reached the company boardroom, where directors quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. This was not just any passenger making a complaint, it was Marcus Davis, a CEO whose voice carried weight across industries. By the time the plane was halfway through its journey, the story had already reached social media. Passengers had whispered about it, and some had quietly typed messages to friends. One passenger even posted, "I just saw Marcus Davis defend his mom on our flight after the crew tried to push her out of first class." Powerful moment. The post began to spread quickly. Back in the cabin, Grace rested her head against the seat, closing her eyes. Memories of her younger days drifted through her mind: the small apartment she had raised Marcus in, the nights she had gone without food so he could eat, the mornings she had walked miles just to get him to school safely. She had never wanted recognition for her sacrifices. She only wanted Marcus to succeed, to be happy, to live with dignity. And now, seeing the man he had become, she felt a quiet pride bloom in her heart. Marcus noticed her resting and smiled softly. He whispered, almost to himself, "You deserve this peace, Mom. You deserve the world." When the plane finally touched down, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of landing: seat belts clicking, bags being pulled down, phones turning back on. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Passengers weren't just thinking about their next meetings or hotel rooms. They were thinking about what they had witnessed. As they waited to disembark, several passengers approached Grace and Marcus. The sympathetic woman was the first. She leaned down and said warmly, "Thank you for letting us witness this. It reminded me of my own mother. She raised me the way you raised him, and I see the love between you two. It's inspiring." Grace smiled and nodded, too moved for many words. Marcus thanked the woman sincerely. Another passenger, the young man from the couple who had whispered earlier, approached awkwardly. "Sir, ma'am. I want to apologize. At first, I thought maybe there had been a mistake. I judged too quickly. Watching what happened, it made me realize I need to do better. I'm sorry." Grace gave him a gentle smile. "It's never too late to do better," she said softly. Her kindness touched him, and he nodded with gratitude. Even the businessman who had smirked at her earlier stepped forward. His face was red with shame. "I misjudged," he admitted quietly. "I've flown first class for years and thought I knew what belonged here. I was wrong. Please accept my apology." Marcus looked at him evenly, then glanced at his mother. Grace gave a small nod, and Marcus replied, "Apology accepted. But let this be a lesson: never measure a person's worth by what they wear or how they look." The man bowed his head, humbled. As they walked off the plane, Grace felt lighter. The sting of humiliation was still there, but it had been replaced with something stronger: a sense of dignity restored, not only by her son's actions but also by the lessons others had learned that day. Outside the plane, airline executives were waiting nervously. They rushed forward to apologize, offering words of regret and promises of change. Marcus listened calmly, his arm around his mother's shoulders. "This is not just about my mother," he said firmly. "This is about how you treat every passenger. I expect new training, new policies, and real accountability. If it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. That has to end." The executives nodded quickly, promising immediate action. Grace, standing quietly by her son's side, marveled at the way he used his voice. He wasn't just speaking for her. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. In the days that followed, the story made headlines. Newspapers wrote about the incident, highlighting not just Marcus's powerful stand but also Grace's quiet dignity. Social media buzzed with admiration. Many called it a lesson in respect, in love, and in the importance of never judging someone by appearance. The airline issued a public apology, announcing new mandatory training for all employees. But more importantly, people everywhere began talking about the story at their dinner tables, in their workplaces, in classrooms. Parents told their children, "Always stand up for what's right. Always treat people with respect." For Grace, life returned to its simple rhythm. She still wore her modest clothes, still lived with humility, still valued kindness over luxury. But something had changed. Everywhere she went, people recognized her not just as the mother of a famous CEO, but as a woman whose quiet strength had inspired a movement. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Marcus, watching the sunset, she said softly, "I never thought my life would touch so many people." Marcus smiled, his arm resting around her shoulders. "Mom, you've always touched lives. You just didn't see it. That day on the plane was only the world's chance to finally see the strength I've always known was in you." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. What had started as a painful moment had turned into a powerful lesson, not just for the passengers on that flight but for everyone who heard the story. And in that quiet evening glow, with her son beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: complete peace.